Let's talk topwater spooks in the spring. It's one of my favorite lures to throw in the spring, and quite honestly, one of my favorite lures to throw all season long. The thing that makes spooks so valuable in the early spring is when the bass are being finicky, which they are most of the time. A spook can be one of those lures that will even get those picky bass to eat, and that's something that is such a like is one of those things that's so important in the spring to have a lure that's like, I can't get these fish to eat anything else, but a small spook can do it. One of my favorite lures for that is the Rebel jumping minnow. I've used Rebel jumping minnows and I've talked about them ad nauseum, but the reason I always talk about them is because for the size that they are, which is like 4 inches long, they can mimic a ton of different bait fish, and especially ones that when the bass are feeding on it, they're historically very picky and hard to get to eat. So one of the lures being the Rebel jumping minnow. Another great one is Pumbaa Plug's Walker. I really like the Arm Smith, Jig Smith, both the regular size and the junior are great in the spring too. The Yozuri Top Knock is another really good spook that I use a lot in the spring, as well as there's the Yozuri Hydro Pencil is another really good one. So all of those like small, to medium sized spooks are something that I throw a ton in the spring. I had one scenario earlier this spring where the bass were blitzing on sand eels, and what happened was they were moving out of an estuary and along a beach front, and I had them for probably maybe 2 hours straight, and I was using a Rebel jumping minnow. This was early May, maybe the first week of May, and I was catching 30-inch fish every single cast with my little Rebel jumping minnow. They wouldn't touch anything else. You could throw algags at them. You could throw little any other soft plastic you can imagine. Little what am I trying to think of here? I'm doing the motions now so I can remind myself in my head when I'm trying to think of a sluggo. That's what I was trying to think of. So you can throw sluggos at them. They weren't eating anything. So that was, to me, the most important thing I had in my plug bag, and I had one. And I remember I broke the hook off of one of the trebles on it, and I was like getting a lot of missed strikes. All my other ones were getting bent out. I always change the hooks on my Rebel jumping minnows because they're like made for freshwater fish, and even then I'm sure you can bend them out on a largemouth bass. They're that bad. So I like the 3X Strong 2.0 VMCs. I think that those fit the best for the Rebel jumping minnow. And as far as what you want to do when you're working that is, I like to do little twitches with my wrist as I'm reeling very slowly, and you're getting it to do this nice walking back and forth action. There's a few different ways that you can actually work it, where you're having it walk back and forth consistently. You can stop it and then continue to work it and then stop it, or you can do pop, pop, pause, so it's just walking back like twice and stopping. Basically, if the thing is moving on the surface, the bass are probably going to eat it. As well as I've had scenarios where the bass have been really picky early spring, moving up onto sand flats, and like some big bass too doing this. There's another scenario here where I was early spring, the tide turned, and the bass started to come in with the tide, and there's just huge schools of like really legit big fish, and they were coming in. And I remember I hooked this one bass, and it was big, and it's running, and I'm like, man, this is a nice bass for like maybe it was the first week of June, and I got it in. It was 38 inches, but as I was reeling that fish in, following in behind it were bass that were like 40 to 48 inches. I mean, huge fish, twice the size of that 38-inch bass that I hooked. I hooked like the smallest one out of the school. There's like 6 other fish in that school. So it shows you that even that small little spook will get some big fish to eat it. I like to throw it when it's in skinny water, because what's going to happen there is there's not a lot of different lures you can throw when the water's super skinny, or if there's like seaweed or anything like down there that you can get hung up on. A lot of the time that will be the best scenario to throw these spooks in. When it's skinny water, the bass tend to be spookier. So they, obviously if you're throwing a big plug in there, it might not go after it because there's just too much commotion going on. Where if you have something that's small, it's right up on the surface, has a very subtle walking action, they'll be more likely to hit it. As well as there's nothing better than seeing the bow wake of a bass flying through the water and then absolutely crushing one of those spooks up on the surface. To me, there's almost no better like sight than that, especially if it's a really big fish. And especially when you hook a really big fish in shallow water like that, there's no place for that bass to go but out. And you'll get an unbelievable run almost every time from a fish when it's hooked in shallow water like that. So that's like another reason why it's such a deadly lure. When you can get bass that are being picky in shallow water, thinning, maybe up on the surface, those are the scenarios that you want to throw spooks at. You can catch bass on them at night too. I know it's a kind of one of those things that people are a little bit unsure of. Oh, throwing topwater at night. There's certain lures that definitely work okay, but not great. There's always lures that you could throw that would be better. For instance, something like a pencil popper, throwing that at night. There are scenarios where that probably would work, but there's always going to be a better lure at night for you to be throwing for the striped bass. Where a spook, especially if the water is shallow, like I was talking about, really big bass will come up into shallow water, and then at night they'll still be looking at the surface, especially around full moons when it already has like a good amount of ambient light out. Spooks will work very well. And so fishing spooks at night, like jumping minnows, are something that will work extremely well during that early spring period of time where I'm fishing a lot of skinny water that is going to warm up quick. It's definitely going to be that first place that those big fish will move in, or fish in general. So having something that is a very subtle presentation, still very visual, will also help you realize if there's fish in that area. That was one of those things, first fish of the spring for me. I was working a Rebel jumping minnow in, and the fish jumped out of the water behind my lure. I was actually the only fish that I even saw, the first fish of the season I even saw. I didn't even catch a fish that day, but I saw that there was a bass there. That was May 1st. So I knew that there was fish around. I just had to get luckier and actually catch one. But that's the funny thing, like being able to actually visually see that there's fish there oftentimes will prove to you whether that is a swirl behind your plug, or whether you're out there in the spring and there's nothing really going on, and something jumps over your spook like it did for me. Another thing that I always want to stress when fishing topwater lures, because you can actually visually see what's going on, what I really think is one of the most important things is to fish with your hands. And what I mean by that is when you're seeing the spook getting knocked out of the water multiple times by bass, what you have to do is just, grit down and keep working that spook. Do not hook set and pull that spook away from the fish, because as soon as you do that, you're going to definitely decrease your likelihood of that fish coming back to hit it again. Where if you just continue to work that spook like nothing's happening, you'll have a good chance at that bass coming back again and again and again until it actually gets hooked. And the amount of times I've seen people work spooks, have a huge fish come up and hit it, and they get too excited and they do this crazy hook set and the thing goes flying, miles away from the bass, happens too often. So what I always say is you're fishing with your hands. When you feel the bass grab it, not when you see it, when you feel the bass grab it, that's when you can hook set. And even then, if you pull the spook out of the fish's mouth because you felt it, keep it working. You never know if that fish will come back, or a fish, it might be in a school of some other bass and another one out of that school might come back and hit it. So it is very important to make sure that you're going to continue to work that spook no matter what you're doing. As far as rods go for working spooks, especially in the early spring, things like the Rebel jumping minnow, you can get away with throwing a 7-foot rod or a 6-foot rod. And I like to throw faster action rods when I'm using like small spooks like that. You can definitely impart more action to the spook that with them. When you get up to a bigger and bigger spook, actually more of a softer action rod, more moderate, can be better for loading into the action of the plug, where it will speed up a little faster. But that's getting a little bit too into the weeds, and I'll talk about that in some videos to follow about fishing like really big spooks during the summer and things like that. But early in the spring, small spooks, definitely one of those things that are just killer when it comes to fishing for those first schools of spring as well as those first really big bass of spring. I've always found that a spook or any real topwater lure, when the bass are being a little bit picky, will end up culling those bigger bass up to eat. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.